Black people?
Well, they call themselves both black people and African people. In fact, the name of the country itself means black people.
Egypt means black people?
Yes. See, the word Egypt is not in the language of the old Egyptians, or old, I prefer to say, Kemetic people at all. That name does not appear until Egypt is finished as a nation, and it's under the control of foreigners, namely Greeks. But if you look at the name that Egyptians wrote when they describe themselves, they call themselves Kemites, or Kemet, K-M-T, the phoneme K-M and a T. And it has a little picture of two people besides the K-M-T, which is the way to make the meaning of a word clear. That's called a determinative. And you have a man and a woman showing both sexes, and then you have three little lines under it, which means plural. So that means men and women plural, and black men and women plural, and that means black people, which some Egyptologists have suggested means black dirt or black land because of the land around the riverbank. But the argument, the definitive argument on that, I think, has been presented by Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop, who died a couple years ago, and it was his work that, from the basis of linguistic and cultural analysis, showed that they were indeed referring to themselves as a black people. But there's more to it, because they not only referred to themselves as black people, they referred to themselves in all instances when talking of their origins as African. For example, their home, which they call the Holy Land, was south of Egypt. They call their home Ta Neter, or Ta Neteru, which meant land of the gods. And they said they had come from upriver, going south, you go up. And so they had come from up south, and they said more specifically at the foothills of the Mountain of the Moon, where the god Hapi dwells.
Now, there are two mountains of the moon, is that correct?
There may even be three. There would be at least, the two would be Mount Kilimanjaro,
which is in Kenya.
In Kiswahili, that means Mountain of the Moon, from Kenya. But also Mount Rwenzori, which is in Uganda, on the other side of Lake Victoria or Lake Nyanza. That is also sometimes referred to as Mountain of the Moon. And that is at the source of the White Nile, which would be consistent with the description of the Egyptians, on the equator of where they came from. There's also a Blue Nile, which starts at Lake Tana in Ethiopia, and there are mountains around that lake as well, which are also sometimes called Mountain of the Moon. So in either case, the source of the Nile, White or Blue Nile, would be deep in Central Africa and would be where black people have always resided.
To some of you, Dr. Hilliard's arguments seem outrageous, but traditional Oxford and Cambridge-trained Egyptologist Dr. Gay Robbins doesn't think so. She supports some, but not all, of Dr. Hilliard's statements. For example, she uses these words to describe the people who built the pyramids.
They're an African people. It's strange how often people want to remove Egypt from Africa, but there's clear evidence that in the very early cultures in Upper Egypt, these had connections with Nubia and Africa to the south, and so, you know, we must not remove Egypt from Africa.
Let's talk about a very well-known Egyptian figure, the Sphinx. When you turn to the side, what do you see?
You want me to say that it looks black from the side?
I want you to say what you see from the side.
What you see from the side is a face that's very battered with a broken nose. I think it's difficult to say. Obviously, it's not a typical European. It's not what we would think of as a typical Semite, but that may be because the nose is gone. Wow. But these racial questions are very, very difficult.
Why would you say that?
Oh, because it started last century, and it started with a school of thought that wanted to see the Egyptians as the beginning of all civilization, but who didn't want to think that blacks could have anything to do with this. And so they adopted the Egyptians as honorary whites. They called their land Kemet, that's perfectly true, and it means the black land, because when the Nile flooded every year. It spread black silt across the land, and so they contrasted the black land of the cultivated land either side of the Nile with the red land of the desert. Okay. And black was therefore a good color, and the red of the desert was associated with the god of chaos, the god Set.
Doctors Hilliard and Robbins disagree on one point, and that's the amount of physical evidence we have today. Dr. Robbins says most of the mummies and bodies we see come from late Egyptian dynasties. In some cases, she says, they come even after the dynastic period had ended. Dr. Hilliard agrees with that. He says the mummies we see, such as the one here, come from a period when Egypt had ended as a cultural and political nation and was controlled by foreigners, namely the Greeks and Romans. But he also says we have clear evidence from the ancient Canaanites about what they look like and with what racial group they aligned themselves.
The people who are presently in Egypt are people who came in large numbers from Asia around the time of Muhammad with the spread of Islam. You had a massive immigration into the Nile Valley of Arabic people, Arabic-speaking, Arabic culture people, who mixed with the African population that had been there for thousands of years, the remnants of whom are Nubians, and they look the same now as they did then, especially around the southern part of the country near Aswan. So people are confused, you know, when you look at the present-day Egyptian population and you try to project back in time to the time of the pyramids and what have you. These indeed are different people, and we could show you that on the timeline.
Dr. Hilliard's timeline traces roughly 5,000 years of continuous Kemetic history. What's astounding is the amount of history which takes place before the Greeks and Romans invaded the country. Hilliard speculates that the Egyptian civilization as we know it may have existed several thousand years before the unification of the country. We say unification because there are south and north parts to ancient Egypt. This person brought those two segments together and began the first Egyptian dynasty.
Mina is probably as close to what we think of in stereotype form of a black person as you can get. He was the first king who pulled this country together in Dynasty 1. What we call the hieroglyphics were already in place here. In fact, this line is an important line. This shows how long the ancient Egyptians stayed the same in their way of life. That's why we call this cultural Kemet.
How many years are we talking about?
Now this line, as you can see on the chart, is more than 3,000 years long. But it's actually longer than that. In other words, we don't have a chart long enough to show how far back in history this line goes. So there was a culture in the Nile Valley before Egypt became a nation, before Kemet became a nation. And what Mina did was to take what was called the North and the South, which had rulers, and put those two parts of the country together, uniting the two lands.
Thus creating what we know as
Thus
Egypt.
creating Ta-Meri, the beloved land, or the two lands, which we now know as Egypt. There are two stories on the age of the Sphinx. There's one story that has the Sphinx as the face of the pharaoh who built this middle pyramid in Giza. This represents the three pyramids of Giza. There are more pyramids than that, but this represents that particular pyramid by Pharaoh Ka-Afre. However, I believe the best evidence shows, as John Jackson shows in his book, Man, God, and Civilization and African Origin of the Introduction to African Civilization, that the Sphinx, or Hora Makhet, which is his real name, should be dated somewhere back here, off the chart, about 10,000 years ago. And regardless, it's still the face of a native black African person.
And obviously created by a civilization with really high technical skill.
To sculpt in 3 dimensions a perfect face, which is what the you would have to say Hora Makhet or the Sphinx is, would definitely suggest very technical antecedents, because after all, this is an incredibly long monument. You know, it's almost like 100 yards long. The monument is carved out of a solid piece of stone, so you have this relief figure carved in stone, and it's still standing. You know, now that the combination of things suggests a real level of technical understanding of material.